I'm only here to pave the way for the big footsteps that will come afterwards. Taking Professor Merrill's place in the last minute. So don't expect too much from me. It's just a short notes I gathered this morning to be able to do that with you this morning. Professor Michael Mell's topic is about the conditions of leadership. In other words, his topic was supposed to talk about what are the conditions that frame leadership today in the region. Not only leadership, but the diplomacy environment. And so I'm just going to focus on that. But I wanted to, in terms of three quotations that I wanted to put up this morning, and one in the next slide is a quote from Thomas Paine in 1776, and he says that these are the times that try men's souls. Can you change the slide, please? These are the times that try men's souls. And Thomas was speaking at the time of the American Civil War and the lack of recruitment for the American army to depose the colonial British. And so it's in that context of conflict that was happening that he added this quotation. The next one was by Woody Allen, the actor. And it was a quotation in his graduating speech, which is not really speaking to a graduating class, but in an article that he wrote in the New York Times. And he said, more than other time in history, mankind faces a crossroad. One path leads to despair and utter hopelessness, the other to total extinction. Let us pray to have the wisdom to choose correctly. And the third quote is from Prophet Jeremiah. This is what the Lord says: stand at the crossroads and look, ask for the ancient paths, ask where the good way is and walk in it, and you'll find rest for your souls. I wanted to cite these quotations particularly because of the times that we are in. And the next slide is to say in terms of what is the time that we are in. And these two authors, economists, Anderson and Sally, they made a comparison between where we are now and where we were before by putting up an image of sports and say they compare it to the societies they were in. One is they're saying the tension between a football society, which you call soccer, and the tension between that and the basketball society is very much alive today. And so they did an analysis of the English Premier Soccer game for one season, about 8 months of games. And they said that if we are, in terms of institutions and society, where would you invest most of your resources, finances, technical skills, and training? Because in the in the soccer society, makes sense for us to invest in the weakest members of the team, right? Because if the team is to be successful or score or win whatever the competition is, you need to bring the weakest members of your team up to scratch. Invest in their skill levels, the training, and whatever else that you need to invest on. Now compare that to, they said, compare that to basketball societies. You don't invest in your weakest teams, weakest members of the team. You invest in the strongest members of the team. There's only 5 or 6 players in a basketball, right? And there are 2 who are running around, particularly the weakest members. The 4 are the ones that you need to invest in. And they're the ones who score the baskets, whatever that may be. But he said, they were saying, they did a comparison because they said that from the 1960s until the turn of the century, societies have been investing their time and resources into the strongest institutions. Governance, education, universities. But what has the problem since then is because the strongest institutions have become stronger, but the weakest institutions have become weak. And so they were saying that the challenge now is to invest, to become a soccer society, a football society, where you invest in the weakest members of your society. Which therefore makes sense in the times that we live in, that we invest our time, our money, our efforts into the weakest members, because soccer is the interactive game, right? And so you invest your time and your money into those areas. Now, the second part about that slide is that it is to do with a slide of social cohesion in the Western world. And the indicators for what is happening is that, you know, the Keller poll that has been running, you know, since the 1960s. But they say that from the 1960s onwards, there is the shift of people who previously, in the scale of, you know, a graph that has something like this, where the largest majority find life, you know, pretty much happy. They're okay. Where there is this bulge in the graph. But from the 1960s, the bulge in the middle of the graph has shrunk. Yeah? So you find a lot more people very unhappy, and a lot more people, very less, have become very rich. And so the majority of those in that bulge in the middle has shifted to the population that have said they have become very unhappy. And so that's the Keller poll. And so they measure that within a period of 50 years, and then they found that's the trend today. The next thing is to do with the Google Ngram. It's a Google tool. But that Ngram, the tool, they synthesized publications from the 19th century onwards. So any publications that came out from the 18th century, from the 1800s, they put it into Ngram. And so if you type a word or a phrase going back to the 18th to 19th century, it will pull up prominent words that were used, right? During a period of time. So if you type in, say, God, it will pull up in the decades from the 18th, 19th century up onwards to now, how many, you can practically measure it. You see how often it's used, and then it goes down, you know. So what they did was, they found out from the 19th 60s, the astronomical rise of the word I. And so it has become, from the 1960s onwards, and it corresponds to the time the sexual revolution happened. That individualism has become prominent in the language of our societies. And so the word I rose just way out the charts. And so, and you'll see it in the pop songs. Those of us who listen to the 60s, even the 50 pop songs with Simon Garfunkel, they sing about us, we, community, what's happening. But since then, M&Ms, those pop singers. And so when you analyze the lyrics of the pop songs, they said the word I began to appear prominently in pop songs from the 1970s onwards. And so what has happened is that our societies, especially in the Western societies, have become very individualistic. Yeah? With the sudden rise of the word I, and then you have the sudden rise of these kinds of words: self-actualization, self-realization, self-fulfillment, self-esteem, self-determination. And so what I'm trying to say is that culture has changed dramatically since the 1960s. Now, in the next slide, it's not only that culture has changed, but the physical climate changed. Okay? And so you go to the next slide, Lily, please. Just to show, just to show that there is these two tidal waves of change. One is the physical climate change that we are experiencing, and the second tidal wave is the cultural change that today we are not talking much about. We are more focusing on climate change and the issues around it, which is fair enough, because that is impacting on us. But we are less and less talking about cultural change as it's happening in our societies today. And it's not strange things here in Fiji. Depression, loneliness have risen, mental health. Those are indicators that the cultural change are impacting quite dramatically in our societies. Drugs have become a big issue. Why is it? So what is happening in the Western societies in the 1960s is happening in our Pasifika household. And so the question then is, how can we address that? But let me say a little bit more about that, because what has happened in the Western societies and today here in the Pacific is that our lives have been covered by three Western narratives. And these are, in terms of number one, the secularization thesis. And those are the four things that happened between the 400 years that these theses have implemented and impacted on every generation since then. The secularization of knowledge in the 17th century, of power in the 18th, of culture in the 19th century, and morality in the 20th century. So this secularization thesis is one of those that have impacted on us today. One, mainly because we are schooled in that thought. Yeah? And if you are a student of history and the trends over the years and the decades, then you would know. The second narrative is about westernization. And basically that narrative is about making everyone else the same as the Western world. From architecture to agriculture. You need to do your farming in a similar way as the Europeans do. You need to build your homes the similar way as the Europeans do. So the whole idea of westernizing the rest of the world as per how you see your reality, the westernization theory, narrative. Your theology has to be the same with us in Europe. Your studies, sociology, anthropology has to be the same with the study and as we in Europe. And yet, in the fringes of these narratives, these dominant narratives that we have been schooled with, and which our forefathers and mothers pester us to go into education because of these things, on the fringes of those are three Pasifika narratives that we not very often want to study, yet we lived it. Number one, and it's been highlighted by Reverend Dr. Nico, is the spirituality of tapu. Being able to be silent, the ability to discern in silence what is and what ought to be. Yeah? I mean, the Archbishop would know in terms of the spiritual conversations that has been happening within the Catholic Church, is that spirit of tapu, discerning. Yeah? And all of our cultures have that spirituality of tapu, whereby we come away for a while and we rest. And let our land rest for a while, our marine resources rest for a while they rejuvenate these things. And let our land, insect, whatever it may be. The second narrative is to do with an ecological ethic of balance. And is to do with how much should we get from our environment to sustain us. We only fish enough for the day. That kind of storyline. Huh? We only get enough for the day. An ecological ethic of balance and enoughness. And the third one is to do with the political philosophy of mutual contradiction. And Professor Vai, who's here, speaks a lot about that. But it's a political philosophy that governs our diplomacy, that governs our leadership, and how we interact. And you'll find this more in terms of protocols, oratory, that even if you have differences, these differences are articulated within oratory, dance, protocols, whatever it may be, and the differences are resolved within that arena. So diplomacy, that philosophy, needs to be factored more and more into how we conduct things. I wanted to say also that Narakopi was from Bougainville. No, I think he's from PNG, right? Not Bougainville. Yeah. And then two are from Samoa. They spoke eloquently about this political philosophy, mutual contradictions. And that's totally opposite to what Plato said in the philosophy, that if one is the truth, the other one cannot be true and had to be erased, had to be done away with. Now we look at the three Western narratives, is that the characteristics of those are very different from the characteristics of, say, the three Pasifika narratives. You look at the three Western narratives, And this is articulated by Dr. Vaai, who talks about expansionist, the three Western narratives. It's all about territory, conquest, conquering, more and more. The next characteristic is about being extractive. You extract the minerals, you extract whatever, knowledge, minerals, whatever, values. The third one is it's hegemonic, that the narratives is about you believe in us or you don't. And if you don't, then we will erase your identity from memory, that kind of thing. Yeah? The fourth aspect is about solely focus on the human person, anthropocentric. You look at the characteristics of the three Pasifika narratives, it's very, very different. And it talks about continuity. How shall we continue our identity? Yeah. How shall we mentor our children to maintain their identity to the next? It's not about conquest, it's about continuity. Yeah? The second one is to do with cultivation. How can we nurture and mentor those? The third one is to do with relationality. And the fourth one is cosmological. It's not only about the human, it's about the whole cosmos, cosmological. So you'll find in terms of why the Western world and ourselves in the Pacific have chosen the three Western narratives and their characteristics as the conditions of our diplomacy and leadership. I'm just trying to put that background to why today we are more and more on the Western narratives and the characteristics of the Western narratives than we are on the Pasifika narratives and the characteristics. Look at what I'm trying to say, eh? That our leadership and diplomacy is more on the left side of the slide than it's on the right side of the slide. That's our challenge. How can we at least make that shift in our leadership and diplomacy, nurturing and mentoring, to make that shift more from the left to the right? But that's our challenge today. I wanted to show the impact of the leadership and diplomacy that has been rooted in three Western narratives and characteristics. I wanted to show this to you. On slide 6 is this. There's a story behind this. And 5 years ago, when I was in the Solomon Islands, in Munda, in Western Province, and we were going through this social analysis workshop. And it's a very normal thing, because when out of the formal training we came out, we have a cigarette, we have smoke, and whatever else we do. So I was asking them to tell the story about what happened in the year 2000, the Solomon Islands. And so they were, but one thing that caught me was this. This pastor, he said he was in Honiara when it happened. And his simple explanation was that development is, there was a banner at the Chinatown end of Honiara that read, development is yellow. And there's a banner at the airport end that read, development is white. Now, aside from what do you call it? The inherent racism in it, right? Yellow meaning the Chinese, because the reference is to the Asians, right? And the white meaning the white, the Palangis, those who, yeah? And so what I'm trying to say in this particular story is that in our minds, that there are two forms of development currently. One is white and one is yellow, meaning the Chinese form of development, and the one is the white form of development, right? And what's happening now at the regional level, national level, there's a clash between the two. But where are we? We haven't actually articulated our form of development, something like that. And it's important to know that since the 1960s, our forebears have been educated in a form of development that is now known white, right? And there's very little opportunities given for us to articulate the kind of development that we wanted to see. Then the next slide talks about, in terms of theology, is that in the same workshop, the next slide, please, is that this is in the Roviana dialect, which I come later to know that it's not the word kwa, it is the word mami, which they used. But for them, when they were talking about the image of God, they're saying it's not the human person only, it's everything else. And it implies, therefore, that for the Roviana people in the Solomon, in the Western province, that for them, the image of God is in the forest, in the rivers, and with them as human beings. And so the thing is that it questions then how is the Genesis text is interpreted then. And the second one is that's purely a European interpretation of the image of God, which is purely anthropocentric. And so you have the two classes of things. One is cosmological, the image of God is cosmological, and then the other one is the image of God as purely anthropocentric. And you wonder why, well, you shouldn't wonder now, why extractive industries are happening, because the image of God is only human. It's nothing to do with the land, nothing to do with our streams and rivers. Now, I brought this story because it is a challenge to theology. It is a challenge to the articulation of how we understand the biblical text. How can we reinterpret the Genesis text without being biased to it? And remember that we inherited into hermeneutics or interpretations through our training of centuries of study from those in Europe. And we take that for granted. Now, the thing that I wanted to can you go back to the previous slide, please? Another one? The one before that? Yes. So why is this happening? The Western world, the three narratives that have governed the Western world for 400 years have broken down. That's why it's happening in the United States. One commentator did say that right now, the Western world is running on empty. There are no narratives since the three Western narratives have broken down. And the Western world is running on empty. And so we look at what's happening in the US right now, there's a vacuum of a narrative. The governing, the organizing narrative that should organize a society that has been missing and lacking. For us in the Pacific, what is it? What are the narratives that we should organize ourselves around? And that's the most important part, is that if we continue to rely on Western narratives that have all broken down, yet we continue to sustain that through our own institutions in theology. Look at USB and FNU. Then we are perpetuating something, stories that have given, that lay waste to our forests and oceans. But we do not have organizing narratives for ourselves. So I wanted to present this because in one way, it is very hopeful. Where Western philosophies are about impersonal truths, Pasifika philosophies are about personal and collective truths. Where Western philosophies are about detached observation, Pasifika philosophies are engaged participation. Where Western philosophies is about a single ideal picture of the world, Pasifika philosophies is about the irreducible multiplicity of perspectives. Where Western philosophies search for truths that are universal, ours is about truths that are particular. Western philosophy is about a discovery of harmony. Ours is about a cognitive dissonance and mutual contradictions. Where Western philosophy is about the truths that we see, ours is about the truths that we hear. And we know what we hear is most often true than what we see. Our Western philosophy is about truths thought, ours is about truths lived. It's not an abstract, it's that our people lived it every day. Yeah? It's not that you go to a village, it's not that they sit down and explain to you. Instead, it's lived out in the agriculture, farming, fishing, whatever else that they do. Where Western philosophy see knowledge as cognition, ours see knowledge as relationship. And where Western philosophy is about conquest of ignorance, ours is about authenticity and sincerity of being and the redemption of our solitude. So I wanted to put that side by side, and there could be more in terms of the contrast and comparisons, is that that there is a lot of hope given the validity of our own Pasifika philosophies. Yeah? And it has more affinity with the biblical text and teachings, right? Than would be the Western philosophies are. And so I wanted to have that done. And so the last slide is to give you these two quote paragraphs, and it reads: in Pasifika today, we live in a time where we have maximum of choice and minimum of meaning. Science tells us how to live, but not why. Technology gives us power, but does not tell us how to use that power. The market economy gives us choices, but does not tell us which choice to make. And democracy gives us the freedom to choose who we want to be, but does not tell us how to choose. And all of which expand our power and choices, but they don't tell us how to use those powers or choices, nor about who we are, why are we here, and how shall we live. And for more than 150 years, Pasifika whole-of-life philosophies lay dormant in the fringes of development and education, thinking and policy making, research and teaching and in leadership and diplomacy mentoring. Yet for thousands of years, these philosophies guided and grounded the journeys of Pasifika people. It is these that will provide our people the answers to the questions who we are, why are we here, and how shall we live. So in summary, I just wanted to say that we are, because we have inherited the Western philosophies, we are in the midst of two tidal waves, right? You have the physical climate change that is now a crisis in the world, and then you have another tidal wave of cultural change. If only we look at the social indices that are happening, not only in Fiji, but around the Pacific, of the high rate of suicide, depression, mental health. And you know, these indicators are saying something about the changes in our cultures that are happening around the same time as climate change. And so we are in the Pacific are facing two tidal waves in that sense. The challenge for us now is to say, okay, we are and have been living the three narratives so far in our lives, but we have Pasifika narratives among ourselves, which will need to ground the way forward for us. Huh? What is that? I have no idea. What are the three Pasifika narratives that are and we need to organize and base our leadership and diplomacy with? And on those narratives, what are they? So that's my brief contribution. Hopefully, Professor Michael Mell will be happy with that in his place. So thank you very much for listening.